Who did history depict as a hero, but is actually a villain? Story 1, Jerry the Mouse from Tom and Jerry. Tom is a household cat, and it's his job to hunt Jerry. While Tom might do some crazy crap on his own, he's literally just following the order of his owner. Exterminate the vermin, or you'll get kicked out of the house. Not to mention, sometimes Jerry is the one who starts the fight. He steals food from the refrigerator, knowing that it might put Tom responsible for his selfish actions. And he sometimes taunts Tom when he's not bothering him even. As a child, we root for Jerry for being the underdog. But now as an adult, I can wholeheartedly say that I despise Jerry from the bottom of my heart. Story 2. Thomas Edison. Many of his parents were based on stolen ideas and inventions, but Edison was simply first at the patent office. After Tesla invented alternating electric current, which would provide a great technological progress, Edison funded the campaign against it, during which was electrifying to death dogs as the proof of Tesla's invention. Fun fact, the American movie industry is based in Hollywood, CA, because that was the furthest spot in the US away from Edison. When Edison would try to sue independent studios for patent infringement, the distance made catching or suing them extremely expensive and impractical for Edison, and California judges were more likely to rule against him. Story 3. Augustus had thousands of wealthy Romans slaughtered to take their wealth, made his closest family miserable with forced marriages and divorces, exiled his only child, and later her daughter as well, and of course launched campaigns of mass ending and enslavement against foreign tribes. But that was part of the job description, I guess. If we judge him by today's standards, he was a horrible person. If we judge him by ancient standards, he was flawed but overall pretty good. By objective standards, he was probably the best emperor Rome had, and set a standard for hundreds of years, if not longer. Byzantine Empire. While he did banish his daughter, that was because he couldn't show favoritism in the Lex Julia, which was a law against adultery, and his daughter was accused of committing it. I'm pretty tired, but yeah, Augustus is nowhere near a villain. Questionable in some ways, yes. But times were different back then, and he improved Rome greatly. Story 4. Most of the heroes that died in the Alamo were shifty degenerates that were running from legal problems or financial ruin. Not to mention the entire reason Mexico went to war with Texas was because Anglo-American settlers who moved in began using the cheap land they bought to cultivate cotton, among other crops, using bondsman labor. Mexico passed a ban on slavery in 1829, and 7 years later they ended up in a war against a renegade region of their country, filled with American settlers that refused to even talk about eventually phasing out slavery. All the talk of freedom and democratic rights were a precursor to the South's spin on why the Civil War happened. Texas was literally just an invasion of drunks and opportunists turned slavers that refused to obey the law of the country they emigrated to. Story 5. Not considered by most people, but people who were in Yeltsin's team in the 90s tried to convince Russians that they were heroes. They saved Russians from famine and freeze, provided vital reforms, and didn't reach the end of the crisis. In fact, these reforms were prepared before their arrival and provided very hastily. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it put the whole Russian economy in a very difficult position. And then they didn't do anything to fix it, only begging for loans from the IMF and investing in pyramid schemes. Story 6. George Washington. By all accounts, George Washington is at best a jerk, at worst, a war criminal. The Iroquois called him Town Destroyer for his genocide of over 40 Native American villages during the Sullivan Expedition. Thomas Jefferson considers him to be a despotic tyrant. George Washington is a hard master, very severe, a hard husband, a hard father, a hard governor. From his childhood, he always ruled and ruled severely. He was first brought up to govern bondsmen. He then governed an army, then a nation. He thinks hard of all, is despotic in every respect. He mistrusts every man, thinks every man a rogue, and nothing but severity will do. He has no idea of people being left to themselves to act. He thinks that they cannot think and that they ought only to obey. Also, he signed the Fugitive Bondsman Law to prevent bondsmen like his escaped Oni judge from seeking refuge in other states. Story 7. Julius Caesar. The man is mostly seen as a hero, but was in fact a warmongering dictator who committed multiple acts of what we'll now call genocide. Caesar's mortal enemy, Cato the Younger, was equally respected in Rome, even after his defeat. When Caesar had his triumph, he showed a giant portrait depicting Cato's death. The crowd supposedly started to jeer and even cry at the sight of it. Though Cato opposed him throughout his entire career, Caesar was careful not to demean him after his triumph. It was too much of a sensitive topic for Romans. Cato was a staunch defender of Roman Republican values and way of life. Caesar destroyed everything he stood for. Story 8. Winston Churchill is evil pretty much everywhere outside the US and even a mixed bag in the UK. He was a big cheerleader of how great fascism was. Before leaving for London by the midday train today, Mr. Churchill received representatives of the Italian and foreign press. Mr. Churchill informed his audience that he had prepared what he, an ex-journalist, considered the questions and answers most likely to help them in their work, and that a typed copy of this would be given to whomever desired one. The following are extracts in his own words, from the impressions made upon him by a week's visit to Italy. You will naturally ask me about the interviews I have had with Italian statesmen, and in particular with Signor Mussolini and Count Volpi. Those interviews were purely formal and of a general character. It is a good thing in modern Europe for public men in different countries to meet on a friendly and social basis and form personal impressions of one another. It is one of the ways in which international suspicion may be diminished and frank and confident relations maintained. Story 9. By all accounts, Mother Teresa's hospital was a charnel pit where people suffered and died in agony, receiving only incredibly primitive care, often starving and dying in droves from easily treated ailments. The conditions in her mission were compared to a concentration camp by observers. This was while she was raising millions and millions of dollars in donations for the church. Mother Teresa believed in an old Catholic school of thought that the greater one's suffering is in life, the greater the reward granted in heaven after death. Coincidentally, she had no problem raking in cash for the church hand over fist, whilst starving and neglecting hundreds of people to death at a time. Story 10. Andrew Carnegie is thought of as the epitome of philanthropy and being a self-made man and an immigrant, but how he did it was despicable. He was a union buster and abuser of his workers of one of the worst kinds, and what he didn't have the stomach to do himself, like actually end the workers who protested his labor practices. He partnered with Henry Clay Frick to take care of it. Frick is another case. He was a real piece of work, but his mansion was donated to New York City as an art museum, and it is just about the nicest one. Ironically, I find he had amazing taste in art. He has 3 of the 27 existing Vermeers, and bought them long before anyone thought Vermeer was really any good, except the Dutch, of course. Turners, Whistlers, Rembrandts, Degas. He has them all, and the most beautiful ones you will ever see, except for the big Degas of the little girls with their maid, which is meh for him. What an amazing place, an incredible gift to the city, but look at what cost it came. Story 11. Depending on who you talk to, Napoleon Bonaparte. Everyone knows he's a national hero to the French, but to the rest of the world, he was a horrible person. He's definitely a dicey one, but here's why he is defended. Prior to the French Revolution, the only people who held power were aristocratic people who got their position on the basis of inheritance. Governance was completely hereditary and not based on skill or effort or anything else. One of the advents of the Enlightenment was the idea that it is a person's skills, work, and passions that should define their value, rather than anything to do with birth, the everyman hero sort of figure. People were starting to view artists and early industrial capitalists as heroes for being self-made, an idea that only recently has become a virtue. In this coming new mode of thinking about heroicness and virtue, along comes Napoleon, a poor Corsican who by his natural ability and loyalty, and studious, bold, and commanding nature, was rocking through the ranks of the military, and in a few years' time would come to rule not just France, but most of Europe in lightning speed. This was so important, because before that, the only people who were seen as being able to rule a country was a king or queen, a person that had that position because it was given to them by God. But here we have a man who went from the lowliest ranks of the world to being the most powerful man alive, ruler of the greatest country on the planet. He was the ultimate embodiment of the Enlightenment spirit of meritocracy and the idea that sheer talent and hard work could elevate any man to prominence. This idea since then has been the norm in more or less all Western countries to a greater or lesser amount. The idea that hard work alone is enough to make it, and that everybody is fundamentally equal, in the sense that royal lives are not categorically different from the lives of others. So sure, we can look back and see a tyrant and an imperialist monster, but people like Napoleon less as an intelligent policymaker to be studied and imitated, but more as a symbol of the anything is possible, everyman enlightenment spirit. Story 12, Richard the Lionheart. When I was a kid, he was represented as a kind of god-king warrior, epitome of the noble Englishman. He wasn't like that at all. He was a total tit who bankrupted England with his taxation to fund his crusades. He got captured on the way back, and that required a king's ransom from his English subjects to release him. But he despised England. He didn't really speak English and lived most of his life in France. While John was a thoroughly unpleasant person who had horrible relationships with the English nobility, he was a better king than Richard I and better than he gets credit for. John was actually interested in the day-to-day aspects of ruling and was a good administrator, but he never had the reputation for military success that Richard enjoyed, and for a medieval European monarch, that was not a good thing. Story 13, Paul Revere. His famous ride never even made it all the way to Concord. He was captured by the British and released in time to hear the beginning of the fighting in the distance. He was an arrogant, privileged officer who was never liked or respected by his fellow soldiers. He was tried by court-martial for cowardice and insubordination, and was at least partially responsible for the crushing defeat of American forces during the Penobscot expedition. Story 14. Lenin is always pictured as the guy who made the Russian Revolution and was betrayed by Stalin, who turned it into his self-imposed murderous dictatorship. Lenin was actually a pragmatic, amoral man who had no moral restrictions whatsoever when it came to impose his one-party rule over Russia, even going so far as to advocate ending peasants who were refusing to give lands to the collectivization of agriculture. Stalin himself in 1928 would enforce mass collectivization of agriculture in the model Lenin advocated in early post-revolution years. Yes, Lenin would step back and, being the pragmatic man he was, put NEP in plan. Story 15. Well, there was this guy in my nation's history, a mathematical genius. As a child, he made corrections to the math textbooks that remained in the books until the 60s. We wanted to take them out after his fall, but math is not very political. He graduated from our military academy with the highest grades in the academy's 100 years of history. He did humanitarian work and saved hundreds of thousands of lives, maybe millions in Europe, decorated by many nations for his humanitarian work. There are certainly millions, if not tens of millions of people in Europe who have at least one grandparent or great-grandparent who survived due to his work and aid. He ran the British diplomatic mission in Russia, while the British were barred from doing so, got decorated by the Brits for that. Then he went into politics, became Minister of Defense in 2 separate governments without party membership, on the basis of his personal competence. And then he fell. His name was Vidkun Quisling, and it has become a synonym across the world for traitor. Story 16. Robert Mugabe was a national hero for Zimbabwe. He came from a poor family, trained as a teacher, was imprisoned for sedition, for criticizing the white minority government, fought a war against them, won independence, and became prime minister. He expanded healthcare and education, and despite being a socialist, kept mainstream capitalist ideology around. Then he became increasingly bitter about white land ownership, became executive president in 1987, a dictator in all but name, refused to leave office, and oversaw the worst economic collapse in history. Story 17. Benedict Arnold seems like the ultimate example of this. Before becoming the most famous traitor since Judas, he was a legendary military hero who arguably single-handedly won the American Revolution. He won several battles with genius tactics and dramatically turned the tide of the Battle of Saratoga by disobeying orders after being stripped of command and confined to his tent, charging to the front of the battle lines and leading a surge by personal example, taking a bullet in the leg for his trouble. Winning Saratoga turned the tide of the war. If you could pick one single act by one single person that most directly led to the American victory, that would be a great choice. He was a great general, but he was terrible at politics, and politics was more important to advancement than skill. He was friends with Washington, but other generals hated him, which is how he ended up stripped of command and raging in a tent at Saratoga in the first place. Between that and his leg wound, he ended up benched with a desk job in Philadelphia, and bitter at the incompetent military leaders who got promoted past him through political maneuvering. Being the city's military commander led him to parties where he met Peggy Shippen, a beautiful socialite and Tory sympathizer who became his wife. She brought him into a plot to steal America's military plans and turn them over to the British, coaxing his resentments into full betrayal. His name is now synonymous with traitor. Years after the war, living out the rest of his life in London, he ran into an old friend from the States. They had a few pints, and as they were heading home, Arnold asked his friend, "How do you think I'd be received if I came back?" His friend replied, "They'd cut off the leg that took the bullet at Saratoga and give it a hero's burial. Then they'd hang the rest of you." An unmarked monument of a boot, commemorating an unnamed hero, stands at Saratoga to this day. Story 18. Nixon. If he had owned up to Watergate, like Reagan owned up to Iran-Contra, he probably would have been viewed in a much more positive light. He's pretty well regarded for his foreign policy, though it definitely wasn't perfect. He probably didn't actually have any role in the break-in. It's more about the lies and covering up. Couldn't get out of his own way and was too paranoid. Not sure he's really a die a hero type, but at least die an above-average president situation. Story 19, Sun-shin, who won many battles, only to be backstabbed by military and political rivals. He was villainized, beaten, and reduced to the rank of a common soldier twice. He was reinstated as admiral after most of the navy was destroyed by Japan, and then used knowledge of terrain and sea currents to defeat Japanese forces that outnumbered his 13 ships, 25-1. He later died a hero in battle, and is remembered as one of Korea's greatest military commanders. Lived long enough to be the villain twice, exonerated and died the ultimate hero. Story 20. Vlad, Dracula aka Vlad the Impaler, a prince of a place called Transylvania, now a small part of what's known as Romania. Trying to protect his small country, but because his use of scare tactics, putting heads on wooden stakes to scare his enemies and those who went against him, he gained the name Vlad the Impaler and was later become the legend of Dracula due to his actions and his last name. Dracula, which means dragon, was used to make the legend of a demon. Story 21. Juan Manuel de Rosas was a prominent historical figure in Argentina. He enjoyed great popularity among the population and served as the governor of Buenos Aires from 1829 to 1832, consolidating all public power in his hands. During that period, Rosas managed to pacify the country and led the Federalists in the war against the Unitarians. However, after a series of conflicts in 1835, he returned to power with the promise of creating a constitution, which he ultimately did not fulfill, arguing that the conditions were not suitable. Instead, he pursued all his opponents with his militia called La Mazorca and implemented harmful measures for the free market. He also attempted to annex Uruguay to the Argentine Confederation and monopolize the revenues of the Buenos Aires custom, affecting the trade of other coastal provinces with countries like the United Kingdom and France, whom he faced in a significant battle in 1845, when they tried to navigate the rivers of Buenos Aires. In 1852, Rosas was overthrown by an army of 50,000 soldiers, composed of Brazilians, Uruguayans, and militias from coastal provinces, led by a former collaborator of his, Justo José de Urquiza. After his defeat, he went into exile in Great Britain and passed away in 1877, widely regarded as a villain by official history. In Argentina, his figure is controversial, as while some criticize him for his authoritarianism, others, like myself, see him as one of the most influential figures in the country's history, who defended Argentine sovereignty and the Federalist cause. Story 22. I would say a great many elected prime ministers in any nation, where such positions are not subject to term limits, Canada, the UK, Japan, managed to live through a version of this. Largely applies to the US as well, though some US presidents who leave office due to term limits would probably have been able to win a third term. They are often super popular and have the support of their political party when they are first elected, and when they are finally voted out, they have often lost the support of the electorate and their political party, and are held responsible for many things that were never really under their control to any degree to begin with. End communication. Story 23. Bashar al-Assad, president of Syria since 2000. He was an eye surgeon living in London with no political ambitions until his brother died in 1994. He said he wanted to open Syria to the internet, to the West, and be a reformer. He inherited the leadership of the country in 2000 and started a massive crackdown. Then the Arab Spring happened, and he became a butcher, leading one of the most brutal regimes this century. I can't think of any other doctors who became dictators. Story 24, Robert E. Lee. His family was early Kennedys combined with the MacArthurs for a political and military family. He married Mary Anna Randolph Custis, 1807-1873, great-granddaughter of Martha Washington by her first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, and step-great-granddaughter of George Washington, the first president of the United States. A son of Revolutionary War officer Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee III. He is the nephew of Charles Lee, who was an American lawyer and politician from Virginia who served as United States Attorney General from 1795 until 1801. First cousins, twice removed with Robert Henry Lee, who was an American statesman and founding father from Virginia, best known for the June 1776 Lee Resolution, the motion in the Second Continental Congress calling for the colony's independence from Great Britain, leading to the United States Declaration of Independence, which he signed. Lee also served a one-year term as the president of the Continental Congress, was a signatory to the Continental Association and the Articles of Confederation, and was a United States Senator from Virginia from 1789 to 1792, serving part of that time as the second president pro tempore of the Upper House. Story 25. This might be a little niche, but Father Junipero Serra. He oversaw the mission system in California when it was still part of Mexico. All California fifth graders have to study the mission system during the focus on state history, but they present it as this wonderful thing, when really the missions enslaved and forcefully converted the local Native Americans. The missions are mostly still maintained, and some are active Catholic churches. They are treated as cool historical sites, when they were really the cause of a lot of horror and death for the Native people. It's only in the last few years that people have started to re-examine the mission legacy, and I don't know if any of that has changed what the fifth graders are taught yet. Story 26. The mutiny on the Bounty is grayer than usually portrayed. Fletcher Christian had been Bligh's friend and was kind of lazy and greedy. He and others mutinied after lying around Tahiti having orgies for months, and they enslaved some Tahitian natives who ended up assassinating him and the other mutineers after they escaped to Pitcairn Island. Bligh was a loudmouth, but actually flogged much less than other Royal Navy officers. He definitely pissed off his men way too much. But he did a pretty epic sea voyage after escaping the Bounty. They later made him governor of New South Wales, where he had another mutiny by the army unit there because they had become corrupt from rum running, and he tried to crack down. So they were both jerks, but one a little more and one a little less than portrayed. Story 27. Most of the Alamo defenders, they were looking to become famous. They defied a direct order from Sam Houston to abandon the fort and basically fought only to become famous. And why were they fighting? Because they had broken many agreements with the Mexican government over taxes they legally owed and slavery which the Mexican government was trying to phase out. Plus, their mythological fight to the last man didn't happen. A large number tried to flee and were cut down, and the rest surrendered and were executed. I don't fault them for fleeing or surrendering, but the myth is that they fought to the last man, because they had broken many agreements with the Mexican government over taxes they legally owed and slavery. You're ignoring the fact that in October of 1835, Santa Anna took control of the government and dissolved the Constitution. He set himself up an autocracy with himself, in sole power as the dictator. He dissolved local state governments and put his friends in charge as governors. He also set up a mandated conversion to the national religion, outlawed private firearm ownership, and yes, abolished slavery. Santa Anna was also xenophobic, and didn't keep it a secret that he didn't like Anglo immigrants in Texas. Texas was only one of at least 3 states that attempted to rebel, including California. But Texas was the only successful revolution. The Alamo is now seen as sort of a stupid move. However, 200 people delayed the Mexican advance by 2 weeks and caused between 500 to 1,000 casualties over a fort of no strategic value, which is significant because the attacking Mexican fort only had at most about 6,000 troops. I'd argue if Mexico was smart, they would have just passed it by. The only reason they didn't was Santa Anna's ego, and that he basically wanted to end every Texan law. The Mexican army was notorious for executing everyone who surrendered in the Texan Revolution.